4,000 years ago, someone in the ancient city of Nippur pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and wrote down the name of a place that, according to the text, existed somewhere beneath the ground we walk on. They called it Kur. Not heaven, not quite hell either, in the way later religions would imagine it, something stranger. A vast realm beneath the surface of the earth, reached through a specific kind of descent, guarded, dark, and almost impossible to leave once you entered. For centuries, this tablet and others like it sat in museum collections, treated as religious poetry and nothing more. Then, starting in the 17th century, a very different kind of thinker began asking an uncomfortable question. What if the ancients were not writing poetry at all? What if they were describing something real? Here is the actual story of the Sumerian underworld, the entrance it supposedly describes, and what we now know, with total scientific certainty, about whether that entrance could possibly exist. Let's start with what the tablets genuinely say, because the real Sumerian sources are honestly stranger and more interesting than most retellings give them credit for. In Sumerian cosmology, the universe was understood as a layered structure. Above was An, the heavens, home to the sky gods. The surface of the earth, where humans lived, was Kai, and beneath that surface lay Kur, sometimes also called Kigal, or Ersetu in the related Akkadian tradition, a vast subterranean realm ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal and her consort. The most detailed surviving description of a journey into Kur comes from a text modern scholars call The Descent of Inanna, one of the oldest extended narratives in human literature, in which the goddess Inanna travels down through 7 gates into the underworld, stripped of her clothing and power at each gate until she arrives, naked and powerless before her sister Ereshkigal. The text describes Kur as a place from which, in the words of the poem, no traveler returns to the world above, a place of dust and silence, where the dead exist as shadows of themselves, drinking stagnant water and eating clay. Other Mesopotamian texts add further detail. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous work of literature to survive from the ancient Near East, describes the hero Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu dreaming of the underworld as a house of dust, ruled over by Ereshkigal, attended by terrifying officials who record the names of those who enter. None of these texts present Kur as a place reachable by ordinary travel, the way you might walk to a neighboring city. Entry into Kur, in the actual Sumerian and Akkadian textual tradition, happens through death, through ritual magic, or through divine power, not through finding a cave entrance and walking downward with supplies and a torch. The underworld, in genuine Mesopotamian religious thought, functioned the way the underworld functions in most ancient mythologies, as a cosmological and spiritual concept describing what happens to the dead, not as a geographical location waiting to be surveyed. So where does the idea of a literal physically locatable entrance to an inner earth come from if it isn't actually in the ancient texts themselves? The answer has almost nothing to do with Sumerian scholarship, and almost everything to do with European science roughly 3,000 years later. In 1692, the English astronomer Edmund Halley, the same Halley remembered today for the comet, proposed a genuinely serious scientific hypothesis based on the best data available to him at the time, that the Earth's magnetic field showed irregularities that might be explained if the planet were not solid all the way through, but instead contained multiple nested, hollow spherical shells rotating independently of each other, each potentially capable of supporting its own atmosphere. Halley was not a crank. He was working from genuine anomalies in compass readings and trying to explain them with the physics available in the 17th century, well before anyone understood the actual cause of those magnetic variations, which we now know relate to the behavior of Earth's molten outer core. Halley's hollow Earth theory might have remained a forgotten scientific footnote, except that more than a century later, in 1818, an American named John Cleves Sims Jr. revived and dramatically expanded the idea, proposing not just hollow shells but actual openings at the North and South Poles, large enough for ships and expeditions to sail directly into the interior of the planet. Sims lobbied the United States Congress for funding to launch a polar expedition to find these openings. Of course, he never received it, but his ideas spread widely through public lectures and popular writing throughout the 19th century, eventually merging with an entirely separate cultural current, a renewed popular fascination with ancient mythology, occultism, and the idea that ancient civilizations might have possessed lost knowledge about the true structure of the Earth. It was during this 19th and early 20th century wave of hollow Earth enthusiasm that writers began retroactively reinterpreting ancient underworld myths, the Sumerian Kur, the Greek Hades, the Norse Svartalfheim, the Hindu and Buddhist concept of Patala, and the Tibetan legends of a hidden kingdom sometimes called Agartha or Shambhala, as literal, garbled folk memories of these supposed openings into the interior of the planet. This reinterpretation was not based on new archaeological evidence or new translations of the original texts. It was based on taking ancient religious literature, almost all of it explicitly describing the realm of the dead or spiritual cosmology, and assuming that because Hollow Earth theory already existed as an idea in 19th century popular culture, these myths must secretly be describing the same thing. It is, in other words, a conclusion that came first, with the ancient texts reinterpreted afterward to support it, rather than a conclusion drawn directly and carefully from what the original tablets actually say. Now here is where the story runs directly into modern science, and where Hollow Earth theory, regardless of how poetically appealing it might be, simply does not survive contact with the evidence. Starting in the early 20th century, seismology, the study of how vibrations from earthquakes travel through the planet, gave scientists an entirely new way to directly investigate the Earth's interior without ever needing to physically travel there. When an earthquake occurs, it sends two main types of waves through the planet, and the way those waves bend, slow down, speed up, and in some cases fail to pass through certain regions at all, tells seismologists an enormous amount about the density, temperature, and physical state of the material those waves are passing through. This technique, refined continuously over the past century using thousands of seismograph stations positioned around the globe, has allowed scientists to build an extremely detailed, well-confirmed model of Earth's interior. A thin, brittle crust, a thick, semi-solid mantle that flows slowly over geological time, a liquid outer core made primarily of molten iron and nickel, and a solid inner core under such extreme pressure that the iron there remains solid despite temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Nowhere in that model is there room for a hollow interior, multiple nested shells, or openings at the poles large enough to admit expeditions. The behavior of seismic waves passing through the planet is fundamentally inconsistent with a hollow or shell-structured Earth. If the planet contained large, hollow voids of the kind Hollow Earth theory proposes, seismic waves would behave in specific, predictable ways, and very different ways than what is actually observed at monitoring stations around the world, every single time a significant earthquake occurs anywhere on the planet. This is not a matter of mild scientific disagreement or ongoing debate within geology. It is one of the most thoroughly confirmed conclusions in the entire field of earth science, verified independently, continuously, by seismic data collected from earthquakes happening literally every single day. Satellite imagery adds another layer of confirmation that further closes the door on the idea of polar entrances specifically. Since the mid-20th century, satellites have continuously photographed and mapped both the North and South Poles in extraordinary detail, including thermal and radar imaging capable of detecting features hidden beneath ice and cloud cover. No openings, gaps, or anomalies consistent with an entrance into a hollow interior have ever been detected. And despite decades of continuous, high-resolution observation by multiple independent space agencies operating completely separate satellite systems. The polar regions, while genuinely remote and difficult to access in person, are among the most thoroughly observed and mapped regions on the entire planet from orbit, precisely because of their importance to climate science and navigation. So if the Sumerian tablets do not actually describe a literal entrance, and modern science has thoroughly ruled out the existence of a hollow interior altogether, what should we actually make of texts like The Descent of Inanna? The honest answer is that they deserve to be understood on their own terms, as some of the oldest surviving examples of a literary and religious tradition that exists, in some form, in nearly every human culture. The journey to the underworld as a way of confronting mortality, transformation, and the boundary between the living and the dead. Inanna's descent through 7 gates, stripped of her power at each one, is widely understood by scholars of Mesopotamian religion as a meditation on vulnerability, loss, and the eventual return from a kind of symbolic death, a theme that resonates across an enormous range of unrelated mythological traditions, along from the Greek story of Persephone's descent into Hades to the journeys into the underworld found in numerous other cultures around the world. These myths were never meant to function as travel directions. They were meant to help people process something every human society has had to confront: the certainty of death and the question of what, if anything, lies beyond it. That doesn't make the original tablets any less remarkable. If anything, recognizing them for what they actually are makes them more impressive, not less. A scribe working in Nippur 4,000 years ago wrote down a story about loss, vulnerability, and return that still resonates with anyone who reads it carefully today, regardless of whether they believe in an afterlife at all. That is a genuinely extraordinary achievement for a piece of writing pressed into wet clay millennia before anyone had a word for literature. It simply was never a map, and no entrance, anywhere on Earth, leads to the place it describes, because the place it describes was never meant to be found with a compass and a shovel in the first place. There's a detail in the descent of Inanna that gets skipped over by almost every retelling of this myth as a literal underworld map, and it's worth sitting with, because it actually undercuts the entrance theory directly, rather than just failing to support it. The 7 gates that Inanna passes through on her way into Kure are not described as physical doorways carved into rock, the kind you might find at the mouth of a cave system. They are guarded thresholds, each tended by a specific gatekeeper, and at each one, Inanna is required to surrender a piece of her royal regalia, her crown, her jewelry, her royal robe, until she arrives at the throne of Ereshkigal completely stripped of status and power. The structure mirrors actual Mesopotamian funerary practice, in which the dead were sometimes buried with specific items meant to be presented or surrendered during their journey to the afterlife. The 7 gates are a ritual and symbolic structure, mapped onto real burial customs of the time, not an architectural description of a cave system someone could theoretically walk into with the right equipment. Reading them as a treasure map-style sequence of physical checkpoints requires ignoring almost everything else the text actually says about what happens at each one. It's also worth understanding why ancient Mesopotamians located the realm of the dead beneath the ground in the first place, because the reasoning, once you look at it, has nothing to do with caves or hidden civilizations and everything to do with how burial itself worked in their society. Mesopotamian dead were buried in the earth, often beneath the floors of family homes or in dedicated cemetery plots dug into the ground. Placing the underworld conceptually beneath the surface of the earth was, in a very direct sense, simply locating it where the dead themselves physically were. This same basic logic, that the realm of the dead exists somewhere beneath the place where bodies are actually buried, recurs independently across an enormous range of ancient cultures that practiced earth burial, which is exactly why so many unrelated mythological traditions, separated by thousands of kilometers and no meaningful contact with each other, ended up describing some version of an underworld located beneath the ground. It is a remarkably consistent pattern, but the consistency comes from a shared, practical relationship between burial practice and cosmology, not from a shared secret about the planet's actual internal structure. There's also a broader question worth asking directly. Why does the idea of a hidden world beneath our feet keep resurfacing, generation after generation, even after each version of it gets thoroughly debunked? Part of the answer is almost certainly psychological rather than archaeological. The unexplored, by definition, is where speculation gets to run freely, and for most of human history, the deep interior of the Earth genuinely was unexplored, in the sense that nobody had any direct way to observe it. Before seismology matured into a precise science over the course of the 20th century, the inside of the planet really was, functionally, a blank space that imagination could fill with almost anything. Ancient mythology filled that blank space with the realm of the dead, framed in spiritual and moral terms appropriate to ancient religious thought. Enlightenment-era science filled it with hollow shells and magnetic anomalies, framed in the mechanical terms appropriate to 17th century physics. Occult writers, a century later, filled it with hidden civilizations, framed in the dramatic terms of early 20th century esotericism. Each era, in other words, filled the same unexplored space with whatever explanatory framework was culturally available to it at the time. What's different now, and what genuinely separates this moment from every previous one, is that the space is no longer unexplored. Seismology has mapped the interior of the Earth with a level of precision that simply did not exist for any of the earlier eras that produced these theories. We are no longer guessing about what lies beneath the crust based on magnetic anomalies or ancient poetry. We can directly observe how the planet's interior behaves, continuously, using physical evidence collected from earthquakes happening literally every day, all over the world. That doesn't make the older theories embarrassing or foolish for their time. Halley was doing real science with the tools he had. The Sumerian scribes were doing real theology and literature with the cultural framework they had. What it does mean is that anyone today still pointing to an ancient religious poem as a literal map to a hidden entrance is choosing to ignore more than a century of directly observed, repeatedly confirmed physical evidence in favor of a story that was never meant to function as a map in the first place. There's one final piece of this worth addressing directly, because it's the question most people actually want answered after hearing all of this. If the ancient Sumerians weren't describing a real hidden location, were they at least describing something they had genuinely encountered? Some real cave system or geological feature, even if they understood it through a mythological lens? It's a reasonable question, and the honest answer is that there is no solid textual or archaeological evidence connecting the descent of Inanna or any other surviving core-related text to a specific real-world cave system, mine, or geological feature anywhere in Mesopotamia or the surrounding region. Unlike some other ancient texts that clearly describe and reference real, identifiable geography, trade routes, named cities, specific rivers, specific mountain ranges, the underworld texts deliberately avoid grounding Kur in real navigable geography at all. That absence is itself meaningful. Ancient Mesopotamian scribes were perfectly capable of writing precise geographical descriptions when geography was actually the point of a text, as seen in surviving trade records, administrative documents, and historical inscriptions describing real military campaigns across real terrain. The underworld texts read completely differently, deliberately vague about location and intensely specific about ritual, emotion, and cosmological structure instead, which is exactly what you would expect from a religious and literary tradition, not a travel account describing an actual place anyone had physically visited and could later locate again.